Hello, I'm San Francisco Mayor London Breed. I want to start today by thanking everyone in San Francisco. Thank you for your patience, for your resilience, and for listening to our public health leaders. I know the last several months haven't been easy for anyone. They certainly haven't been easy for me. Every day I hear about the struggles people are going through, from friends, from family members, and from the community. While San Francisco has been a leader in the fight against this pandemic, every day we suffer losses. People are losing their jobs, people are losing their grip on their mental health, and worst of all, people are losing family members to this disease. But even as we endure these losses, I'm hopeful for the future. These months of public health crisis and social unrest have shown us that when we come together, we can have the hard conversations and make the tough choices to do what needs to be done. Not just save lives, but to address systemic racism head on and change society as we know it. Now, I know today is about our budget and our path forward, but as we step into the future, one that I'm hopeful for, it's important we take a moment to recognize where we've come from. At the beginning of this year, we were living in a different world. Our unemployment rate was at a historic low. Tourism was at an all-time high. Our hotels were full. We all had plans to shape the future of this city we all love. I know I had plans to address homelessness and housing, to reimagine our mental health system, to improve transportation and make our streets safer, and build a more equitable city, to lift up those who too often are left behind. Like I said, we had a lot of plans. What we didn't have plans for was the coronavirus, but it certainly had plans for us. So here we are today in a very different San Francisco, with small businesses closing and schools struggling to bring kids back to the classrooms, with over 180,000 San Franciscans filing for unemployment, and facing a $1.5 billion budget deficit. While the coronavirus pandemic has challenged our city like never before, and while its impacts have been devastating, especially to our low-income communities and our seniors, we have seen San Francisco come together in a way that makes me proud. Proud to be mayor, yes, but also proud to be a San Franciscan. We worked together to make sure thousands of people had access to medical support, to testing, food, and housing. We moved forward emergency policies to protect tenants and businesses from evictions, give people emergency sick leave, and keep workers safe. We've raised millions of dollars in donations through Give to SF to support small businesses, workers, and vulnerable residents. We've seen people organize to check on elderly neighbors or to deliver groceries for those who can't leave the house. While nursing homes across the country have been devastated by this virus, we haven't had a single death among the over 700 residents at Laguna Honda Hospital. We've seen community groups rise up to support our most vulnerable residents in the Bayview, the Mission, and other hard-hit areas. We've seen the spirit of San Francisco rise to meet this challenge, to flatten the curve and then rise once again when the virus came back a second time. And today, we are proposing a balanced budget that closes that $1.5 billion deficit while still meeting the needs of our city. Through all of this, we have continued to protect our public workforce. Let's be clear, when we talk about 180,000 San Franciscans applying for unemployment, not one of those people is doing so because the city cut their job, not one. As our economy plummeted, we wanted our city workers to focus on their health and the health of their families and on serving our residents during this crisis, not on whether or not they would have a paycheck. With the budget I'm proposing today, I want to continue to prevent all layoffs. But to do that, we need our labor partners to work with us. We need them to agree to delay any planned wage increases for 2 years. So far, we are having good conversations with the firefighters and the police officers on delaying their raises, and I'm hopeful other unions will agree to do the same. I don't think this is too much to ask. Our entire city is suffering now, and we all need to do our part to share in that sacrifice. I want to be very clear. If the unions don't agree to delay their raises, then we will be forced to lay people off. We will be forced to cut city services. We don't want to see those unemployment numbers go up because we are forced into layoffs. That's not what I want. It's not what anyone wants. I'm hopeful that our labor partners will step up and work with us in the coming weeks, because there is a lot we have to do with this budget, including continuing to fund our ongoing COVID response. We all know we are living with COVID for the next year, and likely longer than that. San Francisco has been a national leader in responding to this pandemic, thanks to our efforts to follow the data, build a testing system from scratch, create a robust contact tracing team, and provide food, support, and shelter for our most vulnerable residents. We will keep doing everything we can to get this city through this pandemic, and hopefully the federal government will continue to provide the necessary support. But we know the federal government won't cover everything. That's why we are putting $93 million from our general fund towards supporting our continued COVID response. This is a significant investment, but honestly, it's not really a choice. Without a strong and sustained COVID response, our students won't return to school, people won't go back to work, and our economy won't recover. But even as we continue to wrestle with COVID, we can't lose sight of other key priorities. Our homelessness crisis didn't go away with COVID, and in fact, COVID has made it even more challenging. I know people are frustrated with what they see on our streets. We have had to reduce capacity in our existing shelters by 70%, leaving more people out on the streets. And our outreach workers continue to do very difficult work, all while practicing social distancing. We've met this challenge by moving thousands of people into hotel rooms, trailers, safe sleeping sites, and new emergency shelters. This work took an amazing effort from city staff and our nonprofit partners, work that normally takes months and years of planning and implementation done in a matter of weeks. In the Tenderloin alone, we've moved over 500 people and hundreds of tents off the streets in the last 6 weeks. We are expanding those efforts to other neighborhoods like Selma and the Mission. While we are seeing some progress, frankly, it's clearly not enough. We need more than short-term hotel rooms. We need more than parking lots for safe sleeping sites. We need housing, lots of housing. That's why this budget funds 1,500 new units of supportive housing, which is part of our homeless recovery plan to move 4,500 people from hotels, shelters, and the streets into housing in the next 2 years. It will help us as a city meet the needs of the unsheltered and our residents who are frustrated by the conditions they see every day in our neighborhoods. We also can't lose the progress we've made on improving our mental health system, including funding Mental Health SF. That means adding more mental health beds, expanding our Behavioral Health Access Center so people can get immediate care when they need it, and improving the system of care for the people struggling with mental illness and addiction. We're also creating a new crisis response teams so that when you call 911 or 311 because someone on the street is clearly having a mental breakdown, we can send a team, which includes a paramedic, a clinician, and a behavioral health peer. We need to shift the burden for mental health response calls away from the police. It's not fair to ask our officers to do the work of mental health professionals, and it's not effective for those in crisis. This is a key piece of our police reform efforts. In addition to doing the work to change how we as a city respond to calls for service, I've also laid out 3 other major areas for police reform: addressing accountability and bias, getting rid of military-grade weapons and equipment, and redirecting law enforcement funding towards the African American community. While all are important, it's the last one I want to talk about today. As a Black woman who grew up in poverty in this city, police brutality was all too common. It was something we expected, and our complaints were usually ignored. 2 months ago, the murder of George Floyd shook this country to its core in a way that I have never seen before. And people responded like I have never seen before. Seeing people, not just African Americans, rise up against police brutality gave me hope that real change in this country is possible. But for those who support this movement, for those who truly believe that Black lives matter, it's important that we listen to Black voices. It's important that we allow Black people to lead this movement. And I'm not just talking about me or any of our Black elected leaders who have been fighting this fight for generations. I mean, we have to listen to the people in the community. We have to listen to the people who have seen and lived the devastation resulting from decades of disinvestment. We have to listen to the people who don't come to City Hall because they've known too many broken promises made by those in this building who believe they know what is best for Black people in this city. That's why the first thing Supervisor Shamann Walton and I said when we announced we wanted to reprioritize funding to support the Black community was that this had to be a community-led process. And earlier this week, the Human Rights Commission released an initial report that highlighted what the community wants us to focus on. This report is the first step in guiding not just the investments we make with this budget, but the change we need to make in the years to come. Changing the inequities in our country won't happen overnight. We won't change the fact that African Americans have the lowest median household income in San Francisco overnight. We won't change the fact that Black people have the highest mortality rate for 9 of the top 10 causes of death in San Francisco overnight. We won't change the fact that graduation rates for African American students in our public school system is just 53%. We won't change that overnight. We won't change the fact that nearly half of San Francisco Police Department use of force cases involve Black people overnight. But we will change these facts. With this budget, we are listening to the community and prioritizing investments in the African American community around housing, mental health and wellness, workforce development, economic justice, education, advocacy, and accountability. As a first step in this effort, we will redirect $120 million from law enforcement to support these priorities over the next 2 years. Let me repeat that. This is $120 million. It's a first step. If we are going to make real change, we need to do the hard work. It's going to take all of us coming together day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I often talk about how I overcame poverty, despair, and violence to become mayor. My goal with these investments and this change in how we prioritize the Black community is simple. I want my story, my experience, to be the norm and not the exception. I want Black girls growing up today to rise up, not in spite of their upbringing here in this city, but because of it. I want Black boys growing up today to thrive because we chose to change how this city and how this country treats our young Black men. not as a statistic or an inevitable tragedy, but as an important part of our city's future. If we accomplish nothing more than that during my time as mayor, I will leave this office proud. I want to end by acknowledging the leadership of a few of the people who are central to this budget process. First, I want to thank Board President Norman Yee and Budget Chair Supervisor Sandy Fewer for continuing to be strong and collaborative leaders whose focus on equity is more important than ever. Over the coming weeks, we will work with both of them and the Board of Supervisors to finalize this budget so that we can continue to deliver for the people of San Francisco. I want to thank Controller Ben Rosenfield for the work that he and his team have put in, as well as all of the city departments who have worked to find ways for us to close this deficit. Finally, I want to thank my budget team, led by Ashley Goffenberger and Kelly Kirkpatrick. San Francisco is lucky to have these two strong, smart women leading this challenging process. And now at this time, I want to introduce Ashley, who's going to give us a short presentation on our budget.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mayor Breed. My name is Ashley Groffenberger, and I am the Mayor's Acting Budget Director. First, I'd like to thank the rest of the Mayor's Budget Office team who worked so hard to put this budget together under Mayor Breed's leadership. Today, I'm happy to walk you through some of the details of the Mayor's proposed fiscal year 2021 and 21-22 budget. The total size of the proposed budget is $13.7 billion in fiscal year 2021 and $12.6 billion in fiscal year 21-22. The fiscal year 2021 proposed budget represents a $1.4 billion increase over the fiscal year 19-20 budget, primarily driven by one-time expenditures and federal revenues related to the COVID-19 pandemic, which go away in the second year of the budget. The total proposed budget is made up of $7.5 billion, or 54% non-general fund expenditures, which include enterprise and self-supporting activities, and $6.2 billion, or 46% of general fund expenditures. It is important to note that self-supporting and enterprise funds are restricted and not eligible to be used to balance the city's general fund budget. These include things like operations at our airport, the Public Utilities Commission, Port, and the MTA. It is also important to note that $3.9 billion of the $6.2 billion in general fund expenditures are restricted by state and federal reimbursements and voter-mandated services for children, transit, and seniors. The remaining $2.3 billion represents the truly discretionary general fund budget available to pay for many of the public services San Franciscans rely on. The Mayor's proposed budget achieves 4 key objectives. It balances the budget responsibly, avoiding layoffs of city employees and major service cuts. It makes progress on shared priorities of homelessness and behavioral health. It reinvests significant resources toward initiatives that support racial equity and identifying alternatives to policing. And it maintains a robust response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Mayor is required by the Charter to submit a balanced 2-year budget. The proposed budget utilizes a variety of one-time and ongoing revenue and expenditure solutions to balance this projected shortfall while also investing in shared priority areas. The May 2020 joint report projected a $1.5 billion 2-year general fund budget shortfall, predominantly driven by stark revenue losses resulting from the economic impacts of the COVID-19 emergency. In July, worsening economic conditions resulted in a further downgrade of revenue projections for the upcoming budget period. To overcome this shortfall, the Mayor's proposed budget utilizes reserves, new revenue, and other savings. The Mayor's proposed budget utilizes $340 million from the city's main economic reserves during the budget period ensuring that reserve balances remain intact to hedge against future risks. The mayor's budget also assumes ongoing excess revenue from the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund, or ERAF, to balance the shortfall. The proposed budget also assumes $300 million that would become available with the passage of the consensus business tax reform measure on the November 2020 ballot. In order to avoid layoffs and maintain critical city services, the mayor has asked the city's labor unions to defer scheduled wage increases over the period of the 2-year budget. The savings associated with that ask are reflected in this proposed budget. Lastly, the mayor's proposed budget assumes many citywide and departmental savings. These savings include things like underfunding the city's capital, equipment, and IT programs, only funding critical projects while deferring other new costs. This also includes savings offered by city departments that keep positions vacant and achieve other efficiencies, all while avoiding layoffs and major service impacts. Taken together, these solutions equal $1.9 billion over the 2 years. Despite the economic challenges we face, the mayor's proposed budget is able to make over $300 million in targeted investments in priority areas. The mayor's proposed budget invests general fund dollars in behavioral health and homelessness, maintaining the investments we've made in shelter, navigation centers, and behavioral health beds, while also seeding new general fund support for vital initiatives such as the Homeless Recovery Plan and Mental Health SF, which will be implemented through the passage of the November business tax measure. The proposed budget also reinvests $120 million in law enforcement funding over the next 2 years to support programs and services that benefit the African American community and advance racial equity in our city. The proposed budget also seeks to prioritize youth, investing $15 million in one-time support to the San Francisco Unified School District to provide needed financial relief and support for vulnerable students. Lastly, the mayor's proposed budget maintains a robust response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, allocating nearly $100 million in new general fund support to support the ongoing health and community response. The mayor's proposed budget is able to close the projected shortfall without layoffs and with minimal service impacts. However, we are just beginning to see the effects of this recession and must remain vigilant of the risks and uncertainties that lie ahead. Before the pandemic, San Francisco had approximately $1 billion in reserves. The proposed budget will utilize about half of those reserves over the coming 3 years, leaving the remainder to hedge against significant risks that far exceed the remaining reserves. These risks include the failure of the November 2020 business tax reform measure, which, should it not prevail, would create a $300 million shortfall in the proposed budget. The proposed budget also assumes that the city continues to receive FEMA reimbursement for eligible COVID expenditures through the end of the fiscal year. Should the federal government declare the emergency over, the city would face a significant financial burden to continue to respond to COVID. A prolonged or worsening of the pandemic would also negatively impact the city's finances, both in the form of ongoing expenditures not planned for in this budget and in worsening conditions that could further slow economic recovery and further downgrade revenues. While we believe the assumptions around excess ERAF and other state revenues assumed in this budget are sound, there is always risk that worsening conditions at the state level could result in further losses of state revenue. And lastly, while this budget proposes many ongoing solutions to solve the projected budget shortfall, the city still faces a structural budget deficit beyond the balanced 2-year budget and must maintain reserves to guard against future shortfalls. To conclude, while the proposed budget is balanced, it is balanced on a number of assumptions that could fail to materialize, which only underscores the importance of maintaining reserves to guard against these future risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you again. Nothing about this pandemic is easy. Nothing is certain. But I believe that the more transparent we are with the facts and the more honest we are with the challenges we face, the better off we will all be. I know we will get this budget passed. We will continue to keep people healthy and safe, and we will get through this challenging time together. Thank you.